I'm Paul Salvatori, and this is Palestine in Perspective for the Palestine Chronicle. In this third episode of the podcast series, I speak with Israeli-American author, journalist, and pro-Palestinian activist Miko Peled. I reached out to Miko after reading an insightful piece he wrote on what's known as liberal Zionism, and how ultimately that's an oxymoron or contradiction of terms. You can find a link to that article published by Mint Press News in the show notes. More broadly, our discussion focuses on Israeli society and how it views the crimes its government commits against the Palestinian people, historically and at present. Miko illuminates a lot for me. Frankly, I was beside myself at times. There are deeply troublesome yet everyday aspects of Israeli society, as you'll hear him share, that reflect a sheer disregard for even the basic humanity of the Palestinian people. Instead, much of the society celebrates their brutal oppression and domination. Indeed, this goes beyond mere indifference towards the suffering of others, and for me at least, is difficult to square with a modern world where I thought those egregiously violating human rights would never acknowledge their doing so, much less be, for lack of a better term, happy about it. After all, this is most shameful, hardly worthy of being a badge of pride. Here's the discussion. Thank you so much, Miko, for joining me today on Palestine in Perspective. And I'm wondering, just before we get started in earnest, whether you could just maybe give us a brief self-intro and maybe how you got involved in issues of Palestinian justice.
I was born in Jerusalem to an Israeli family, a Zionist family. My father was a general in the Israeli army when I was a young boy. I have a book titled General Thon, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, which sums up really the intro, because being born as a son in a Zionist family, the son of a general, and then embarking on this journey as an Israeli discovering Palestine. It's a journey of discovery, really, because as an Israeli, you don't know that there's a Palestine.
Okay.
And so that's really the gist of the story. And basically, it's a story of stepping out of the comfortable, safe sphere of the colonizer into the sphere of the colonized, to paraphrase Frantz Fanon.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what my journey is all about. And having stepped across that line, which of course in Palestine, geographically is a very short journey, because Israelis and Palestinians live very close to each other,
right,
geographically. It is a huge step, because it is so, the differences are so striking, the differences are so vast between the life of Israelis and the lives and the reality in which Palestinians exist.
Like others, you've done a lot of compelling work that challenges Israel's claim that it's a democracy. So just for audience members or listeners who are not too aware of this sort of issue, what, if not a democracy, how would you define Israel?
I think Israel has been defined very well by Amnesty, by Human Rights Watch, by B'Tselem, as an apartheid regime, and that's precisely what Israel is. It was formed as an apartheid regime, as an apartheid state, and it functions as an apartheid state with all the violent and racist mechanisms that are characteristic of apartheid states. Maybe that Israel has taken it a few steps beyond what's if we refer to South Africa, perhaps, or even the United States, who I believe is also an apartheid state in many ways. Israel has taken it further, and has perfected the apartheid system, while as it is maintaining the apartheid system in order to it's the only way to have a so-called Jewish state in an Arab country, which is what Palestine is,
right,
is to enforce an apartheid regime. And as the apartheid regime is being maintained, the state is also engaged in two other crimes against humanity, which are ethnic cleansing and genocide.
Hmm.
So the so-called Jewish state that was established only 3 years after the Holocaust,
Right.
a time in which the definition of crimes against humanity were invented, were put in place, this so-called Jewish state is being engaged in three crimes against humanity: genocide, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid.
And I know you've talked more than once with Gideon Levy, who I've also had the privilege of speaking with on the show. And I've asked him this question, and I always get really interesting responses on it. I'm just curious to know from your perspective whether Israeli society is divided in terms of support for or against the occupation, or is it mainly for the occupation in 2022, let's say?
Israeli society has always been completely united on the issue of the occupation of Palestine. There's never been any divisions.
Okay.
Divisions that may have existed in the past, or any appearance of division that may have appeared in the past, were artificial and superficial at best. But on the issue, because there may have been some division on the occupation of certain parts of Palestine,
Right.
but on the issue of occupation of Palestine, whether it's 1948 occupation or the 1967 occupation, today certainly there is no division in Israeli society. Israeli society stands completely behind the apartheid state, which of course controls all of Palestine.
So, like groups, for example, like B'Tselem or journalists like yourself or Gideon Levy, that is like a very minute portion of the society, I assume. Is that
Well, but Salem is a human rights organization. It doesn't represent people. It doesn't have. It's not a membership. It's not a movement.
right?
It's a human rights organization which does important work.
Right.
And a small group of people work in it and do important things. They don't represent Israeli society. Gideon Levy, he's a voice in the wilderness.
Right.
Nobody listens to him. Nobody cares what he says. They read him. They get angry and they move on.
Mm.
There's no
Okay.
the only place where Gideon Levy gets any kind of recognition for his work is by people who read him in English.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so, and he's really out of I don't know how many journalists exist in the state of Israel, between all the newspapers and radio stations and TV stations and TV news shows and on and on and on. You have one dissenting voice. And
Right.
when you watch Israeli news, on TV, it's like watching Fox News,
Right.
but on 10 different channels.
Why do you believe that Israel, despite all this mounting pressure internationally, you have the Amnesty report now, Human Rights Watch, the B'Tselem, there's always the UN with the rapporteur reports. Why still does it refuse just to start taking an honest look at itself? Arguably, for example, Canada, I mean, we have such a long way to go in truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, but arguably, the case can be made that the government has taken a baby step. But when it comes to Israel, there seems to be not even that willingness at all. Why is that still happening?
Israel takes a very good look at itself. They just don't see anything wrong. They think that what is going on is absolutely fine. They don't think there's anything wrong with what they're seeing. They like what they see. They justify what they do. They don't think there's anything wrong with it. They think that they justify everything. They see no problem with any of it, other than from time to time there's some criticism of the government when it does not hit the Palestinians hard enough, when they stop bombing Gaza too soon, when they don't kill enough young Palestinian men in the West Bank, or and so forth. That's when they don't arrest and kill more Palestinian citizens of Israel. That's the only criticism. But other than that, Israel doesn't see the Israeli society and Israel as a state, sees nothing wrong with what is.
And I guess that's a good segue into this question. Is it from a young age that students, for example, are raised to believe certain things about the Palestinian people? Is it a kind of hatred or an animus from like day one? Is that how the Israeli state in part maintains its confidence, its public confidence?
Yes, I mean the Israeli education system um, is inherently racist. My sister, who's a professor at the Hebrew University, wrote a book about the Israeli education system called Palestine in Israeli textbook, in Israeli school books. Years ago, about 10 years ago. It came out about the same time as mine. And it shows very, very clearly that the Israeli education system is a systemically racist education system. And the way Palestinians are portrayed is either, I mean, they're not portrayed as humans. They're portrayed either as some kind of environmental issue problem because they're many of them, and there's kind of poverty and that sort of thing. They're portrayed as some kind of a backward society. They're portrayed, of course, as a military threat.
Right.
And that's it. But Palestinians are not portrayed as human at any point, at any time, and constantly the discourse is in Israeli society, everywhere in schools and in synagogue. I mean, everywhere you go is how Palestinians are terrorists, Palestinians are killers, Palestinians want to kill us, Palestinians are, So there is no place where Israeli society, young Israeli students could possibly learn about, say, Palestinian culture, say, Palestinian history. I mean, none of that exists in the Israeli discourse.
Right.
And then at 18, they're given a gun and they're told, well, you got to go protect your country because these people want to kill us. And these people are
Wow.
terrorists. And you have a right to because they're not really human. They're
Yeah.
less than human. So if you kill one, if you kill a child, if you kill a woman, if you kill a civilian, it doesn't matter when they're Arabs. And when that does happen, when an Israeli soldier does kill, then the response is either applause or nothing at all, or it just goes on, uninvestigated,
Wow.
unnoticed.
Miko, I have to say it's shocking at some level for me, because my own academic background's in philosophy, and I remember so much scholarship coming out of Israeli universities on ethics, existentialism, political science, and things like that. And it's just very difficult to square that kind of knowledge production, which, mind you, doesn't directly address the occupation, is happening in the same society.
Society that lives in a bubble. It's a society that doesn't see anything beyond it. Um, and that's why they can exist the way they exist. I mean, they perfected apartheid to a point where you can live across the
Yes.
street, Palestinian town, and not know anything about that town, not know anything, and not even meet the people who live. And I'm talking about literally across the street. And so, I mean, University of Tel Aviv sits on the ruins of Palestinian towns. I'm sure the students there have no idea what happened to the people, what happened to the town,
Right.
and so on. The promenade in Tel Aviv on the beach, is on the
Yes.
ruins of
Yes.
Jaffa, where the homes and people, and I mean, it goes on and on and on. And since there is no acknowledgement of what took place and how Israel was established, then people just live their lives and they feel as though they are some kind of an extension of Europe, as opposed to being, well, they are an extension of Europe. They're colonizers, and just
Yes.
like they're European colonizers. But in terms of culture, in terms of humanity, in terms of ethics, they feel very good about
No, I
themselves.
think it speaks to the erasure too. That was a great article you wrote on, I think it was tourist sites that are where there were former Palestinian villages and such, and there's just no discussion of that. So,
Yeah.
so and also, as you know, I really did appreciate your article on this notion or myth, perhaps liberal Zionism. Just for listeners who might not know, could you speak to what this idea of liberal Zionism is and the end goal of its proponents?
Liberal Zionism is this idea that somehow, somewhere there was at one point, and perhaps could be again in the future, some kind of a liberal, peace-loving state of
Right.
Israel. And it ignores two things. First of all, that the state of Israel was established as a result of a huge crime against humanity, ethnic cleansing and massacres of
Right.
1948. and total destruction and theft of Palestine, destruction of Palestine as a country, and theft of its riches and its resources, all the way to stealing money from the people's bank accounts and property and public spaces, and produce in the fields, and fruit from the trees, the Jaffa oranges.
Right.
I mean, you name it. So that was how Israel began, and a lot of people have this notion: oh yeah, the good old days, Israel was liberal and socialist. Well, it was liberal and socialist only if you lived within the framework of the colonies, of the sphere of the Israeli Jews. And the other thing that they forget is that the the Zionism cannot possibly be that you can't be a liberal Zionist any more than you can be a liberal
Right.
fascist. You know what I mean? But they created this notion that there could be, it's like the J Street phenomenon here in America, this J Street phenomenon, that there could be this friendly, two-state solution, peace-loving, and then they bring up one or two Israeli politicians from the past who promoted the two-state solution. That's complete nonsense, because the two-state solution was only an excuse to allow the expansion of Israeli towns and cities into the areas that were occupied in 1967, while pretending that Israel actually wants peace. So, in other words, it's the people who call
Right.
themselves that and who promote this notion of liberal Zionism are either ignorant or foolish. I mean, there's no other way to hold on to this idea of liberal
Right.
Zionism.
Would it be fair to say that liberal Zionism is not even anti-occupation? Is that it's not?
Of course
Okay.
not. Liberal Zionism is what allows this image of this peace-loving Israel to exist. I always say that the J Street is the fig leaf that allows AIPAC to function.
Okay. Yes.
Even though today they're at odds because they're both lobbies, and they're both vying for the same dollars, perhaps. And so there seems to be some kind of competition between them. But on the major issues of there's absolutely no difference between them
Right.
whatsoever.
I mean, one of the reasons I ask, Miko, is because I'm wondering whether you're seeing within the Palestinian movement or the struggle for justice those who may be anti-occupation but are not pro boycott, divestment, sanctions. And I wonder what that might mean if you've seen it. I've heard about this kind of thing before, and if it's linked in any way to liberal Zionism.
It is liberal Zionism because it's meaningless. If you oppose the
Right.
occupation of Palestine, but you don't support the means with which to fight the occupation, then what are you talking about? How can you oppose something without supporting the means, the very basic means of
Right.
the struggle? You have to struggle. You have to support the struggle to end the oppression. Being against the oppression by wearing a T-shirt that says, "Free
Right.
Palestine," it doesn't do anything. If you don't actively, not just support, but actively
Yes.
promote sanctions against the state of Israel, boycotting Israel, making sure that Israel does not participate in academic, sporting, cultural events, demanding that Israeli diplomats be sent home. If you're not actively involved in the struggle, but you say you're anti-occupation, but you oppose all the means
Right.
of the struggle,
Yes.
what are you talking about?
Absolutely.
Myth of liberal Zionism, that wanting to not wanting to oppose Israel, but not wanting to seem like you don't have a heart or a conscience. It's like in America, politicians like Andy Levin and people like that who pretend that somehow support Palestinian rights, but won't even support the Betty McCollum bill to defend the rights of Palestinian children.
Right.
If you're not even willing to put your name on that bill, which talks about protecting Palestinian children and families from the horrors of the prison system, then you are absolutely not against the occupation. You're absolutely not in support of Palestinian rights.
Right. I mean, it's so action based. I feel like these others are kind of, I don't know, some sort of bizarre idealism where, like, if I say it or if I think it or if I have the right intentions, that is enough. But I agree with you. Certainly, there's so much more involved for justice. So I want to ask you about settler colonialism. I know Ilan Pape and others have stressed the importance of viewing Israel's mistreatment and crimes against the Palestinian people as part of a larger settler colonial movement. And I'm just wondering what your own take is on this. And oh, yes, and this might be the more important point, why you believe the mainstream media fails in any meaningful way to appreciate this one aspect of Israel as being this movement.
You know, interesting about the settler colonial, framing it as settler colonialism. When you travel when you travel in Israeli towns and cities, every other street is a settler street. The colonizers' alley, the settlers' hill, the colonizers' park, the conquerors' hill. I mean, every other street. They're unashamed, but it's in Hebrew. So I remember one time meeting somebody near Jaffa somewhere, which is of course Tel Aviv, and he said, "Oh yes, let's meet by this parking lot. It's called the Occupiers parking lot
Oh, wow. Wow.
or the Conquerors parking lot." I said, and he's a Palestinian. I said, are you aware of what we just said? You know, the name of this place, because it's right next to a park called the Conquerors. You know, these names are used. Occupier, settler, colonizer are used all the time with great pride. But don't
Wow.
you dare say settler colonialism in English, because God forbid this in English, it doesn't sound right. And it makes them look like they are, they're not, of course it's settler colonialism. There's no question.
Yes.
They pride themselves, their entire existence, their entire history and this sense of glory, this sense of, pioneerism is about settle. It's about being settlers. It's about being colonizers. It's about being conquerors. We conquered the land. We settled it. We colonized it. But somehow in Hebrew, they don't mind saying it and admitting it and using these terms all the time.
Right.
They just don't like it when people say it in English. But there's no question. Of course, it's a settler. It is a settler colonial. It's a project without any shadow of a doubt.
It's interesting you mentioned that too, Miko, because I'm wondering if, the defensiveness sometimes when you challenge Zionists about this is that they're upset about you disrupting or puncturing somehow the mythology that they hold so dear. Because it's very, I mean, philosophically, I find it's almost surreal to see what's happening in Israel because, yeah, you have the glorification of, as you said, of the occupier. It's and of the oppressor, and that it's good or not good enough that the military has bombed Gaza, for example. It's like it doesn't square with, I guess, maybe my own Rousseauian notion of human nature, which is that we're fundamentally good as human beings, but something happens, something has to account for this sort of evil we see. And perhaps it's maybe that, I think you've talked about it before in a video. You talk about the three myths, is it, or something?
Right. That's right. That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So do you think that there's like a mythology that's being really held on to tightly that they just Israeli supporters will not let go of whatever is said? uh
They live in a kind of a cognitive dissonance because on the one hand, they say, well, we can't be settlers and colonizers because we're back. This is our country. And you can't be a colonizer if it's your country, or an occupier when it's your own country. However, when they speak about, like I said, when you look at the textbooks, when you see the street names, when you read this great, stories of the great early, founders, they were all settlers and colonizers, without a doubt, and proud occupiers and proud conquerors, without any doubt. It's everywhere.
right.
But in English, they don't like they don't like that in English. And again, the narrative, is the holy grail. Without this narrative that they or myth, there's no existence. So
Right.
they always have to be, not 10 steps, but 100 steps ahead of everybody else, because once you puncture a hole, once somebody's allowed to puncture a hole in the narrative, in the mythology, then it's going to be a very quick destruction of the whole thing. Without the mythology, there's no legitimacy.
Right.
I
Yes.
claim there is no legitimacy. But they have this whole mythology that they've been, perpetuating for 100 years or so, which supposedly gives legitimacy to the state of Israel. But it's a lie, it's a myth, none of it is true. So they have to really be on their guard. That's why, they can't have a dissenting voice on campuses in America, well, anywhere really, but certainly not in the United States.
Right.
They come out after the Students for Justice in Palestine. They come out after anybody, any voice that dares to challenge the narrative, human rights organizations, relief organizations. I wrote a book about the Land Foundation a couple of years ago, Injustice. They were not political in any way, shape, or form, but because the work they did was so effective, they were able to gain so much respect and collaborate with other organizations, relief organizations, that they were a threat to the narrative. And they know this, by the way. And, we've got still 3 men serving very long sentences. There were 5 originally, but 2 have been released in federal prison because they were Muslim Palestinians who dared, again, unbeknownst to them, without intention, dared to challenge this mythology.
Yes.
And Israel has got to stay on top of it, or else they are going down. And right now, they are fighting. They're fighting a defensive war. I mean, they are on the defense all the time. They've got fires everywhere, and they've got to work really, really hard to put out all these fires.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I've seen a massive change, say, over the last 20 years. When I was first in my undergrad, getting involved more in Palestinian solidarity work versus now. It's just, I remember it was even taboo to use the word Zionism. I remember that on campus. You should not talk about Zionism if you're not an Israeli. There was that kind of like chill that we were feeling. And so, but a lot of things have changed with the internet and, for lack of a better term, maybe citizen journalism and people, doing so much on the ground. So I just want to wrap things up here, Miko, but before I do, I wanted to just bring attention to your excellent article that you did recently. Despite what media claim you, IDF chief of staff is a particularly gruesome war criminal. There you make this observation that any person who rises to the rank of colonel or above has to have been engaged either directly or closely in support of war crimes, certainly the subjects of the stories mentioned here in your article. So I'm wondering if you could, because this point hit me very hard when you said that, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. And I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on it further, and whether you have any confidence about whether the International Criminal Court is going to find similar in their own ongoing investigation.
Well, the International Criminal Court is a very slow bureaucracy. They work very, very slowly. I doubt, and it's a very political process too. So I doubt there's going to be any headway made in that regard. I think it's important to remember and to keep reminding people that, who was I talking to? Somebody today, and the Israeli army was mentioned. They go, "Oh, Israeli army, boy, they're tough. They're really tough guys." No, they're not tough guys. They're a bunch of low-life criminals who have never faced an army. Certainly not the people in the military today. None of them, or even none of the generals, none of them have ever faced an army. If they did, they will lose. They will be completely destroyed.
Right.
Which is why they're so afraid of a war with Iran.
Yes.
They all got the stripes on the backs of Palestinian civilians, with the blood of Palestinian civilians, shedding the blood of Palestinian civilians. That's all they are. They're a glorified terrorist organization, nothing more. It's a mafia. They're a gang. They're just a gang.
Yes.
So I think it's really, really important to keep reminding people that even though they have this glory, this kind of myth again of the glory of the Israeli army, they've got this great air force, but they've got all this technology, they've got all this intelligence. They're facing people who have never had a military force.
Right.
Palestinians never had
Yes.
much as a tank. The Palestinians have never had a like a helicopter or a warplane ever. They're facing a people who have never had even the smallest capacity to engage in any kind of military force. So, well, what's the big deal? You stick around long enough, you're going to move up the ranks, and of course, it's required that there's a body count that you bring with you to substantiate your existence, to give substance to your existence as a military person.
Y-
So there's the myth and the look of the Israeli army, which is kind of Americans especially are like in awe of, or I should say everybody in North America actually is in awe. And then there's the reality, which I think is important to bring back, because I don't think I don't think international law is going to ever intervene. I think even after Palestine is free and
Right.
the regime collapses, bringing war criminals to trial is a very complicated process, even when the regime collapses. But it's
Yes.
important to remind people and to be aware that this is what we're seeing and this is what's going on, so they can never justify any of the so-called what they call operations, but really are massacres of Palestinians and assaults on Palestinians.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm trying to remember the name of the article, the one you wrote earlier on Shireen Abu Akleh, and you talked about how sophisticated these operations are and how there was logistically just how complex her assassination was. How does this, I mean, again, it might seem like an obvious question, but how does this, in your view, tie into the ethnic cleansing? Because as you also say, they're so outmatched. The Palestinians, you also talk in your articles, they have rifles that barely work. They're so old. Why so much sophistication, military sophistication for people that are largely or relatively militarily so vulnerable, helpless almost?
That's a great question. I think it raises another question, which is why are people always talking about Israel needing to be secure? The security of Israel we must make sure that Israel is secure. Israel has never been under threat. Who's
Yes,
going to take care? Why are we not talking about securing the lives and the safety of Palestinians? Who is taking care of the safety of securing the life of Palestinians? Who's making sure the Palestinians are safe? Nobody.
right,
Because
right.
what Israel has done through a lot of hard work and lobbying is it manages to get all the cutting edge hardware in terms of weapons, and then it's used as a lab, and this is well known. After every assault on Gaza, weapon sales go up.
Yes,
So there's an increase in the sales of Israeli weapons and others, and so it's become a lab, so it works well for everybody.
right.
Israel likes to look at itself when you see all these, commandos and special forces and all these, glorified names for basically what are, the terrorist organization and different units within that organization.
Right.
And they are facing a bunch of guys with t-shirts and a gun with limited ammunition and maybe or maybe not work. And if these guys get killed, they get killed. If an Israeli soldier gets one tiny little injury, boom, they're air evacuated, and like within minutes they're in surgery. I mean, they got the best of everything.
Yes.
And not to
Yes.
mention the fact that they're well fed and they've got good facilities and they can go home and sleep in a nice bed. I mean,
Yes.
the differences are so striking. But I think the important question is here: why are we not talking about the security of Palestinians? Who is going to
Yes.
make sure that the next who is securing Shireen Abu Akleh?
That's right.
Who is securing all these young Palestinians who are being killed in Gaza? Who are securing the Palestinians who are being killed in other places? Who are securing? I mean, nobody talks about the security of Palestinians, and that should be the conversation, because for almost 100 years, Palestinians have been left to die.
Like Miko, it's a fantastic point you raise because, you often hear in the mainstream, the question, doesn't Israel have, or journalists asking, doesn't Israel have a right to defend itself? And, I almost wonder whether that could be called a non-question because, when you look at what's happening historically and presently, like it's like Israel is never really in that mode of defense. Do you know what I mean? Like it's never has been in that mode of defense. It's always offensive.
Yeah,
It's
but
all.
it's a talking point. It's a diversion.
Right.
It's a
Yes.
diversion. Instead of talking about why are you bombing, dropping, hundreds of tons of bombs on a civilian population in Gaza, we're
Right.
talking about whether Israel. It kind of takes people off guard. Oh wait,
Yes. Yes.
now we're talking about defending the right of defense, not the right of defense. I think it's really important when these questions come up not to accept the premise of the question and can go back to the original issue, which is the Palestinians' right to live, and the
Yes.
Palestinians' right to live in peace, and the Palestinians' right to be safe, and the Palestinian right not to be bombed and
Yeah.
killed and expelled and live as refugees, discarded humans for almost 100 years. That's
Yes.
got to be the question.
Yes.
Israel has never been in a position, like you said correctly,
You're
where
right.
it was attacked. Israel has never been, the security of Israel has never been an issue.
Right.
Granted, Israel's legitimacy is being questioned, but that's because it's a country that is built on theft and crime.
There's also the realpolitik too of, Canada being one. There's no question about it. Our current Canadian government will not sanction Israel, but they will sanction Russia.
Yeah.
So it's who has that power. That's why I do think, BDS, to your point earlier, is so important. It's one thing. It's one thing that can be done. So just to
as constituents, as voters, we have to demand that our elected officials demand sanctions. It's not going to happen. It's not going to go bottom. It's going to go bottom up. We have to demand as voters.
right.
We have to make it very clear to our elected officials that we demand sanctions. That's the only way this change is going to happen.
Yes. So thank you so much, Miko, for this wonderful discussion. I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts or comments.
Well, I think it's beneficial to end on a note of looking into the future. I think it's important to understand that a free Palestine is something we should all be fighting for. I
Yes.
think that we should be absolutely clear about what we're fighting for, which is a free Palestine. And Palestine is a very well-defined country, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, from the northern borders with Lebanon and Syria to the Gulf of Aqaba. And all of Palestine must be free. And if we do our job, and if we work hard as people of conscience, it's not going to come by, not the Messiah going to come and save Palestine.
Right.
Palestine one day. It's going to be us doing the hard work, these kinds of broadcasts. Like you said, people, citizen journalism, I think it was
Right.
great. It's this kind of work, and people getting up in the morning and bugging their elected officials and supporting and supporting any politician who is on the right side of this issue, so that this Palestine will be free. Because if we don't do it, things are going to get far worse. We're going to be, because Israel is on a path to destroying everything that's still left in Palestine. And so it's incumbent upon us to act, because this is the right struggle. And when Palestine is free, we'll be able to look at ourselves and say, we were able to contribute in a way to that result, which I think is important, is historically going to be very important.
Oh, certainly. No, that's a question that's always on my mind. Like, how will people see this, 400, 500 years from now, as with other historical injustices, like who acted, who did not, And I think it's important that people keep that in mind, because it's a bit of a cliche, but there's something everyone can do right now,
Oh, without a doubt.
An honor and a pleasure to speak with you.
Same here. Thanks so much, Paul.
Hope you enjoyed the discussion. I learned from Miko that much of Israeli society, unfortunately, is trapped in toxic myths about Palestinians. Before talking to him today, I was not aware that, far from simply being in denial of Israeli crimes against the Palestinian people, terrible on its own, much of the society is proud of these crimes, as if perversely they are accomplishments, victories, successes in further advancing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It's also frightening. How can any segment of humanity, whether we're talking about Israeli society itself or otherwise, see brutality and violence against another segment as good? Dovetailing with Miko's observations on the falsehoods that underlie and shape Israeli society, I feel that American political science professor Stephen Eric Bronner is helpful here. In his poignant book, The Bigot: Why Prejudice Persists, he states, "The inferiority or evil of the other becomes immutable. Pre-reflective assumptions are introduced and then used to explain his experience, logic, or situation. There is no need for empirical evidence, historical inquiry, or even an immanent logic. Mythological thinking asserts what the bigot already knows. Truth is revealed, not argued. Reality is disclosed, not analyzed. Existence is illuminated, not contested." End quote. I think this begins to answer my question, albeit in a troubling way. Much of Israeli society does not question the racist and destructive belief that Palestinians are non-persons and, by extension, that there's nothing wrong with denying them their full human rights. They are instead a hindrance, an obstacle, a threat to the society and where it wants to go, namely a future that necessarily does not include the Palestinian people. We see attempts to realize this every time, for example, the Israeli state bombs Gaza, and illegal Israeli settlements are built and developed in the West Bank. In both cases, Palestinians are, through death or displacement, forced to disappear. That may be happening geographically far from us, if we're not in Palestine, but it's, as members of the international community, our business. For as such members, we also make up the larger human family. When Palestinians are harmed, that is, our brothers and sisters forced to suffer. We cannot turn a blind eye to this, and as you heard Miko and I touch on towards the end of our discussion, there's something all of us can do to stop it. In the process, and perhaps to end on an optimistic note, I believe we can further pressure Israeli society to take a truthful look at itself, whereby it comes to see, however gradually, the horrors of the illegal occupation of Palestine. The world will not back down from continually holding a mirror up to that society, reflecting those same horrors. Before the internet, it was relatively easy for it to ignore that. Not now. Social media illuminates daily to those within and outside Israeli society what it is doing to the Palestinian people. Personally, I cannot give up on the humanity I share with my fellow Israeli brothers and sisters. They may resent or even hate me for supporting Palestine, and I do, unapologetically. But I do not, and will never harbor the same feelings against them. Freeing Palestine, in addition to justice for the Palestinian people, which of course is absolutely paramount, is about honoring all of humanity. My wish is for all peoples to see beyond the lies that divide us and join together in dismantling the illegal occupation of Palestine, once and for all. Thank you for listening. I welcome your comments and feedback on the show, which you can send me via email at paulsalvatori@simpatico.ca, the same address you'll find in the show description on the Palestine Chronicle website. Till next time, I'm Paul Salvatori, and this is Palestine in Perspective.